You are looking at the last known whereabouts of actor, singer, dancer, and all-around humanitarian Dan McLellan. He was attending a party at this Hollywood bungalow owned by famous screen star, recording artist, and animal hairstylist Tony Reed when he disappeared. Why McLellan left the party in such a hurry, speeding off in his 1988 lime green Ferrari, and what has happened to him in the 3 months since this disappearance, remains a mystery. Though he has been gone for over 107 days with no trace, the police department, for unexplained reasons, have refused to file a missing persons report, and no official comment has been made on this can of Manwich found near his skid marks. Will Williams, an ex-actor turned accountant, had this to say about his mentor, Dan McLellan. You worked with Dan during the early days.
Yes, I did. I had the pleasure, honor, shall I say, of working with Dan McLellan at the Granite Hills Acting Workshop.
Those were the rough and ready days, weren't they?
Yes, they were. Very rough.
Very ready. How long did you know Dan McLellan?
20 years.
20 years?
No, actually about 7 or 8. You see, there's something special about Dan where the first time you meet him, you feel like he's been around you forever.
You worked with him in the show Man of La Mancha.
I played the part of Dr. Carrasco in that play.
And Dan played the part of the victim.
Yes, it seems to me no one can be victimized quite like Dan was victimized in that play.
Is there anything else you remember from that show?
I remember distinctly that we always had trouble finishing the curtain call. Because when Dan would come out to give his bow, the audience would always give him a standing ovation that would seem to last forever. In fact, I remember distinctly one night, I remember watching it, third row. I'll never forget the look on the man's face. An old man. During the curtain call, he had tears rolling down his face. He was so struck by Dan's performance.
It must have been very moving.
It was very moving for all of us.
Do you miss him?
Of course I miss him. He was a good friend, and as an actor he was a demigod. The man was a pharaoh.
A ferret?
A pharaoh! You know, those Egypt guys.
We spoke with playwright and biographer Jeff Jeffries at his La Jolla home. Jeffries, who is said to be completing an untitled book about Dan McLellan, is most famous for his biography of the tragic life of David Young entitled Too Young to Live. We asked Jeffries to describe Dan McLellan in one word, if he could.
There's so many words to describe Dan McLellan. Punctual. And dedication. Dedication was Dan McClellan's middle name.
His name was Dan Dedication McLellan?
That's right.
Well, how dedicated was he?
In Midsummer Night's Dream, he had to change his voice. So he heard somewhere that Marlon Brando put cotton in his mouth for The Godfather. So Dan McLellan stuffed toilet paper up his nose. Now that is dedication. And let me tell you something. His voice never sounded better.
Another person fortunate enough to act with Dan is part-time actress, part-time massage parlor receptionist Louise Lewis. If you had to write an epitaph for Dan McLellan, what would it say?
Well, it would have to say, Dan McLellan. He was always punctual.
Is there anything else you'd want people to remember about him?
Well, the Dan was really hot. He was a very, very sexy guy.
What do you think it was about him that made him so sexy?
Well, It was the body language. The Dan, when he was on stage, he oozed sexuality. Well, he definitely oozed something. And he had this look in his eye that said, "Here I am. Use me."
Pat Patrick, an off-director from Off-Broadway, is teaching Dan's acting style to young actors. We asked him about it.
I was with the first group of students that studied under the Dan.
What was it like working with Dan McLellan?
Working with Dan McLellan was incredible. It changed my life. Before I worked with Dan, I was scattered. I didn't know exactly what I wanted to do as an artist. And then I met Dan and I knew exactly what I wanted to do. I wanted to pass on the McLellan method to other actors so they could take advantage of it.
So you're sharing Dan McLellan's acting performance style with an entirely new generation of actors.
Right, I want to make sure that the McLellan method never fades away.
What attribute of Dan McLellan's would you want your students to carry on?
That's a toughie. He had so many great qualities in his professionalism, but I would say punctuality, because punctuality is very important, and the Dan was always on time.
What about Dan's performance as the bailiff in Witness for the Prosecution?
Well, it was a stellar performance, as all of his performances were.
Didn't he vomit during one performance of Witness for the Prosecution?
Yes, he did. But there's something important to be learned from the vomiting incident of '89. He was so in tune with what the audience was feeling at that moment that he had no choice but to vomit. So that's what I tell my students, to be like Dan, to really have the Dan inside of you. When in doubt, vomit.
Pete Peters, who was once Dan McLellan's stage manager, is now working on a production of Les Miserables at Chaparral High School. He wasn't too busy, so we asked him a few questions about Dan. Peter, when was the first time you met Dan McLellan?
It was in the tryouts for West Side Story.
And what was his tryout like?
Well, I was stunned by the way he mastered the Sondheim lyrics. It's as if he made them his own. He knew he was better than Sondheim, and he projected that. It's incredible.
What did he sing?
He sang, "I'm always alone, I'm always disconnected. With a capital J, I'm a jet all the way." And he was a jet all the way.
Did he get a part in the play?
No,
Why do you think that is?
nepotism. Although, if he could have held that last note just a little longer, he would have been Tony.
What most impressed you about Dan?
Oh, his punctuality, definitely. And his facility to be able to use different accents, while he could use a French accent, a Russian accent, a Spanish accent, all as the same character in the same scene. And the accents would come and go. The audience would never know what was coming next, and neither would Dan. Sort of like malaria.
You were there that last night he was seen at Tony Reed's Hollywood Bungalow.
Oh yeah, all the big names were there. Tony Reed, Dan, Roxanne Nelson and Lonnie Wise and Josh Schmidt. And Alex Auckland was there doing that frog trick she does. You know.
What was Dan acting like?
Well, everybody knows that Dan is a two-fisted Manwich eater, and we noticed that he was hitting the Joes pretty hard. We all knew he shouldn't drive home, but nobody tried to stop him.
Why do you think he was so upset?
Well, he was just turned down for the lead role in the Laurence Olivier story.
I started working with the La Jolla Playhouse, and then I moved on to the Seattle Rep and the Mark Taper Forum. And then the last thing I've done was I did some work with in Oxnard, off Broadway. And right now I'm an instructor at the Tony Reed Acting Conservatory. I teach the McLellan method.
We asked Pat if we could watch him teaching the McLellan method to his students. The first hour of the 8-hour class involved teaching the actors how to stare at the floor during a scene. The second hour involved staring at the ceiling. The rest of the class was spent showing the students how to defecate, urinate, vomit, hawk up phlegm, and perform all the major bodily functions, all on stage, during a live performance, just the way Dan would do it. Pat also suggests to his actors that they eat lots and lots of sloppy joes. That's the Dan method. He grew up on them. As Pat has often said, if you are what you eat, then Dan McLellan is a sloppy Joe. McLellan.
Oh, definitely. Sloppy Joes and the McLellan method go hand in hand.
We asked Jeff what he thought he'd miss most about Dan.
His friendship. You could always depend on Dan McLellan as being a friend. If you're ever down, Dan McLellan would always be there with the sloppy Joe to pick you up. He would give you his last sloppy Joe. The guy would give you the sloppy Joe off his back. It's true.
Did you ever do a love scene with Dan McLellan?
No. I guess that's the kind of thing that girls can only dream about.
But you were in 42nd Street with him.
Yes. And even though his part was insignificant, he seemed to play it perfectly.
And what about his dancing in that show?
Well, it was only in one number. But his dancing in that number seemed to stick out like a sore thumb.
Do you remember the last time you saw him?
I'll never forget it. He said to me, "It's more than a sandwich. It's a meal." I'm sorry.
It's okay. Take your time. Take your time.
It's so unfair.
Yes, Dan McLellan is gone. But as in his life, it seems as though he'll be sticking around forever. Was he a man, a myth, or a legend? We may never know what he was. Some say he was 1 in a billion. We can only pray that that's true.